continuidade à programação. Ainda temos 2 painéis aqui na Arena da Liberdade. Então, eu gostaria de convidar, neste momento ao palco, nós vamos falar sobre o liberalismo e a sociedade livre, como eu dizia anteriormente. O CEO do Instituto Liberal de São Paulo, ILISP, o Marcelo Faria, vai fazer a mediação deste painel. Então, gostaria de pedir um aplauso e as boas-vindas ao Marcelo Faria, que está retornando, aliás, ao palco. Marcelo já esteve conosco esta tarde. E o convidado, neste momento, para falar sobre o tema o liberalismo e a sociedade livre, é o CEO da Atlas Network, Brad Lips. Bem-vindo, Brad. Com a palavra o nosso mediador, Marcelo, por favor.
Bom, boa noite já a todos. E esse painel tem muito a ver com um livro que o Brad Lips escreveu, sobre justamente o liberalismo e a sociedade livre no século XXI, que o ILISP traduziu e estará, inclusive, depois disponível para vocês estirarem. O Brad Lips fará uma sessão de autógrafos a partir das 8 lá no hall principal, e recomendo que vocês não só assistam, como também tenham acesso ao livro, que é muito relevante, e vou deixar o autor falar sobre o livro. Brad Lips is for you. Ele vai falar do púlpito.
Well, thank you very much, Marcelo. I wish that my Portuguese could let me say authentically I appreciate the introduction, but I don't know exactly what you said, but I trust that it was it was kind. It's a real pleasure for me to be here at this conference that I've heard about for so long. Atlas Network is quite proud to be a sponsor of Fórum da Liberdade, and I got to catch up with my old colleague Alex Chafouin, who was talking earlier today about attending this back in the 1990s, so there's a long-standing history here, and I'm just glad to get to experience it myself. It's a very special forum that comes together here. And I want to thank Instituto Liberal de São Paulo for making possible the Portuguese translation of the book that I published about 18 months ago called Liberalism and the Free Society. I'd like to cover some of the topics that I address in the book over the course of this quick talk. But first I'll ask you to indulge me in a little story, because I want to travel back into time. Not too far, just 59 weeks. It was on a Friday, so right about now, maybe a couple hours earlier in the day, that Atlas Network convened a Zoom call, attended by hundreds of our financial supporters and our friends around the world, and featuring 3 representatives of free market think tanks from Ukraine. This was about 24 hours after Vladimir Putin had launched his new invasion of the country, and at the 43-minute mark of that webinar, so I pressed this correctly, Daniel Lupkin of Ukrainian Students for Freedom turned around to talk to a friend who'd poked his head into the room, and Daniel then turned back to our audience and said, hey guys, we're in the middle of airstrikes, so I have to leave and hide in the basement. And for me, that was a sobering reminder that tyranny, authoritarianism has fangs, and it puts lives at risks. And it was certainly an unusual Zoom call, unlike others that I've had. And it was a reminder that we're now living through some unusual history. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how our work has evolved in some unexpected ways as a course of that. Within hours of that call, and thanks to generous friends of Atlas Network, we were able to roll out a plan to make available funds to help our partners survive the war. And not just survive the war, but then to start to make a difference in their own communities. Within the week, my colleague Tom Palmer had relocated himself to Warsaw, and he was they're coordinating among our Polish and Ukrainian friends about ways that we might be able to transport desperately needed supplies into Ukraine that our partners were asking for. And 3 days after this photo, Tom was in Lviv in Western Ukraine. At first blush, this may seem quite outside the skill set of my organization. Atlas Network is a service organization helping free market think tanks by providing professional training to them, running grant competitions to get resources into their projects, running forums kind of like this to bring people together to share ideas. We're not a humanitarian organization, and we had no intention of trying to duplicate the efforts of the Red Cross, which can, at scale, help hundreds of thousands of refugees at the Ukraine-Poland border. But we learned that there were some very specific and very acute needs that we could address, and maybe more cost-effectively than those larger humanitarian organizations. And we did this by staying true to our model, so listening to our partners. Partners like Natalia Melnick, pictured here alongside Tom, who in turn was listening to people in her community about shortages that were happening at the hospitals. So we started to source insulin in Eastern Europe so that we could get it transported to specific hospitals where they were running short. This is a slide of Tom retrofitting bulletproof vests so that medics like these would be able to go into war zones and not be sitting ducks for the Russian snipers that were targeting ambulances. We wound up buying satellite phones and here a Starlink connection so that our friends inside Ukraine wouldn't be cut off from the world as the Russian army attacked the conventional communications infrastructure. The operating model behind this was pretty straightforward. Tom would get these requests from our partners. We'd figure out what we could pay for. We'd figure out how we could source it most effectively by calling on our friends in the global network. And we'd get things to Warsaw, and Tom would then drive them by himself initially into Ukraine. And then rather than returning with an empty van, he would, in those early weeks at least, there were lots of elderly trying to evacuate, and he'd give them rides. And then in order to get supplies where they were most needed, deep into the cities that were under siege, we depended on brave volunteer drivers that our partners inside Ukraine located. And it goes without saying that there were some tragic casualties to all this. These 4 members of Ukrainian Students for Freedom are among the ones who gave their lives to this cause. And just looking at their faces, it's a real humbling reminder of what we're sometimes called to do when we're standing up for the values of freedom. I like to think, however, that they would smile on what has been accomplished thanks to our partners and thanks to the small role that we've played in raising the $3.7 million. Our partners say that what we've been able to invest in has saved thousands of lives. And what's more, by helping our partners stand up in this really patriotic way in the midst of the war, they're now in a position to advocate more strongly than ever before for important changes in policy that are essential for Ukraine's success in the years to come. 2 weeks ago, Tom was there to open a conference assembled by our partners, but with the active involvement of the Zelensky administration, about the need for a flat tax and for a deregulation program to reduce corruption, to spur economic growth, and to make Ukraine a place where people will want to work and want to invest, capable of producing its own wealth instead of being dependent on foreign lenders. Of course, it's real clear that the war is at a really perilous moment. There's big obstacles in front of the country. There's a culture of corruption, which will make any well-intentioned efforts a real challenge. But I think we deserve to be enormously proud of how many people inside Ukraine are now embracing the freedom philosophy. I think that they feel viscerally that they do not want to be Russia. They want to be the opposite of that. And our partners are proving that, or are explaining what that means in practice, and how this could produce something that's really unprecedented. During wartime, governments tend to centralize economic power. And here we have a country that may become the first, to my knowledge, to liberate its economy during an invasion. And what this really shows me, stepping back to the bigger picture, is that history is very fluid, that nothing is predetermined, and there's opportunities for each of us to make a difference. And my colleague, Tom Palmer, regularly demonstrates that. He doesn't know that our team put together this slide, and he probably would be embarrassed by it, but when he tells stories from earlier in his career about working with pro-democracy groups behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War, some of his adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now the way that he just was immediately on this beeline to Ukraine as soon as the war started. Tom's got some really great stories that are kind of heroic and dramatic. But what I wanted to impress upon you is that the most valuable moments of his career probably aren't those that are the best stories. They're the mundane ones where he was working on different projects with people and building trust, working on projects to advance liberty. What's happening in Eastern Europe right now totally depends on the goodwill that's been built up through the years, through Tom's own personal work, but also through the work of my colleagues at Atlas Network, doing things to advance liberty, which had the secondary effect of creating these friendships, these relationships of trust that now enable much bigger things in the midst of this crisis. And I think it's important for all of you to think about how what happens in the future of Brazil may be determined in the corridors of this meeting as people meet for the first time, share laughs over drinks, and start to share ideas about the ways in which a brighter future may be built. Building this freedom movement is the goal of Atlas Network. And my book on liberalism and the free society begins by calling attention to the role that can be played by all of those who take an active interest in promoting freedom. And it's especially important at this moment, I think. It's well understood that we've been living through a global health crisis. I think it's not widely recognized enough that we continue to live through a freedom crisis, where countries around the world, governments around the world have taken unprecedented powers away from people, and they haven't been held account to that. And when you step back, you might think, this is a decade in which people are going to remember it in history as when freedom began to decline. But again, that's not predetermined, and all of us can have something to say about that. We can have something to say about whether this decade might in fact be one where liberty is revived and new life is breathed into this, in part maybe because of the overreaches that we've seen. And we can take inspiration by what has been accomplished in the past by those working for liberty. When I think back on the 4 decades of Atlas Network's existence, I think that we saw the end of apartheid, which is something that our South African partners work towards. We've seen parents in the U.S. Suddenly wake up to some of the failings of our government school system. So we now have this flourishing network of micro schools and charter schools and choice-based education policies coming to fruition. Big changes in development economics, inspired by Hernando de Soto and others, about how property rights are fundamental for improving the plight of the poor, and how entrepreneurial capitalism, not foreign aid, is what's necessary to create an inclusive prosperity. So by my way of thinking, we need to be more ambitious than ever before. Our freedom movement now consists of more than 550 partners. This slide shows the geographical breakdown of where Atlas Network's partner community is located. It now spans 102 countries. And there's a growing appreciation in mainstream places about the important role that such organizations can play. I think the text here says what the think tanks can play in supporting the development of locally led, context-dependent policy change. And from my vantage point as CEO of Atlas Network, the real joy of it is in seeing how this plays out in different places around the world. In Central Africa, in the country of Burundi, our partner CDE Great Lakes made it simpler for people to trade goods across borders. So they no longer needed this web of permissions from multiple authorities that used to steal from them, used to subject women to sexual abuse. So this little change has had this enormous step forward. In India, the Center for Civil Society fought for the rights of street vendors, once considered sort of urban blight that could be harassed with impunity by cops. They now have dignity, they now have legal standing to create wealth through their trades. And then another slide I didn't get pre-approved, but I thought we needed to have a slide with our handsome facilitator here. Last month, we were really happy at Atlas Network to have a chance to recognize the good work of Instituto Liberal de São Paulo, winning our Latin America Liberty Award for its work in convincing leaders in 52 different municipalities about the wisdom of lifting burdensome licensing requirements. The phrase liberdade para trabalhar, is something that I think all governments should be receptive to. So we're very excited by that project. Sometimes these policy wins can seem, small compared to the political campaigns that we tend to follow in the news. But I think that all of these efforts add up, and all of these are really part of what makes us get closer to the big goal that we really all should be able to share. I'd like to think of our big goal as being the rising up of living standards and doing away with poverty. And we know that to do that, you need economic growth. In order to achieve that economic growth, the academic literature is now very clear that comes from institutions associated with economic freedom. I got involved a couple years ago in a research project led by an Argentine scholar named Carlos Newland, who has produced some very interesting findings that show that in order to get these high levels of economic freedom, it really depends upon creating a sense of economic mentality that appreciates free enterprise. And my dream is to someday find a way to empirically prove this final link in the chain, which is that the best way to create that economic mentality that enables those institutions, which enables that economic growth, is nonpartisan work by the kinds of organizations that we invest in. I think that they may be, in fact, the most cost-effective way to set in motion this virtuous chain of events. And I'd love to see Brazil become a case study in this. And I see from the energy in the halls here that there's a really fantastic community of people that are thinking about ways to create more economic freedom, more individual liberty. This slide shows that within this global index of economic mentality that I described, the research project that Carlos Newland leads, that Brazil right now ranks sort of in the middle of the overall sample of countries that we were able to include in the index. The index uses the World Values Survey data that it had collected around 2017 to 2019. And Mexico and Peru and Brazil and Ecuador are the Latin American countries that sort of appear in the middle. Further up in the top third, we have Colombia and Guatemala, and trailing behind in the last third, it's interesting to see Chile alongside Argentina and Bolivia. And the next wave of the surveys being done in 2024 to 26. So I think the question that you all should be contemplating is, where will Brazil be at that time? And more than that, how do we do it? How do we improve Brazilians' appreciation for the kinds of ideas that have been in discussion over the past 2 days here? I hope that each of you has been thinking about this question. Each of you can have an answer. Part of the wisdom of Atlas Network's founder, Sir Anthony Fisher, was to realize that we needed many different strategies. There's not going to be a single answer for how you create an appreciation for the free society. We need lots of people working on this. So I'll be excited to hear, maybe in the question period, some of your own ideas about this. And hopefully, if you take a look at the book, which we'll be distributing at 8 o'clock today, you'll find some of what I put forward provocative, and I'd be interested in your reaction to that. As a starting point, I'll say that one of the things that I feel strongly about is that part of what I just referenced will not be effective for reaching larger audiences, showing that type of correlation between the institutions of economic freedom and GDP growth and investment. I think that makes most people's eyes glaze over. So for a less curated audience, I know that what we really need to do is think more deeply about how you win hearts and minds. And I think that maybe we sometimes use those terms without realizing that we should make sure they're in order. I think we need to win hearts and then minds. We really need to prove that we are empathetic and that we're in solidarity with the people that we're trying to reach if we're going to get them to actually take a fair look at the values that the liberal community stands for. I'll call attention to one product that I think is out in the conference area. I think that Students for Liberty here in Brazil, they produced this wonderful virtual reality film with us a couple years ago called New Hope, which I think you'll really enjoy if you take a look at it, which shows how the values that we're working for affect people in all levels of society, and in this case, a very interesting favela outside of Sao Paulo. So that I think is a great example of the types of products that we should be producing as we think about how we can reach new audiences in a way that clarifies our values, because they have been distorted by people who are not friendly to the free society. And when I think about what we're trying to clarify to people, it really begins with the idea that the liberal community is about respecting the dignity of each person. I think we also have to go above and beyond to prove that we are an inclusive movement that does not buy into the us versus them mentality that you see in so many other ideological and political tribes. Another thing I'd suggest is that we need to really reject the patronizing attitude that many elitists and government have towards people in poverty, seeing them as dependent clients that need to be saved. Most poor people would flourish if there weren't ridiculous obstacles in their way, often created by bad public policy. And we therefore work for the equality of opportunity, not distracted by the illusion that we can or should aspire to achieve some sort of equality of outcomes, some sort of vision of fairness that inevitably is going to be handed down by somebody else in power. We know that free enterprise is what happens when people can use their own talents and freedom, when they can cooperate and compete on a level playing field. And we know that where free enterprise exists, prosperity will follow. And here I think we have to make one final distinction, that we are pro-market. Too many people conflate that with being pro-business. Politicians who say they're pro-business tend to want to give favors to a specific business. And this kind of cronyism is really the opposite of what free market entrepreneurial capitalism is really all about. So I think we have to show up as vocal opponents of that kind of cronyism and politically granted privileges of all kinds. So my book includes some 6 different chapters that really sort of document conversations I had with experts from throughout our global network, looking region by region at how these values play out against different challenges that are especially acute in different parts of the world. So I hope that that's something that you'll want to explore and that'll trigger some interesting creative thinking on your part about how to better advance the free society. And one final slide. I wanted to show the cover of the book, which has this photo, which I chose because I think about half of the people that look at it tend to see a sunset and about half see a sunrise. And the conventional wisdom, at least as I was completing this book and we were coming out of COVID, was that the sun may be setting on liberal democracy and the kinds of values that we stand for as people start to turn to the China model and all these temptations of authoritarian populism. But I challenge you to see the opposite. In my work at Atlas Network, I really become energized every day by the inspiring work of people that are making a difference in their local communities. And when I see all the potential that exists in the ranks of this movement, and certainly in the halls of this fantastic meeting, it gets me really optimistic about the future. So, hope that you enjoy reviewing the book, and we have a book signing at 8 o'clock. And now I think we have some time for questions, but thank you.
Yes, we have some time for questions. You can make your question if you want. There's a microphone there for the audience, right? So if you want, this one is way high. If you want to make a question, feel free. You can make it in Portuguese. If you want, I can translate for you. Don't be shy. Before that, I can make the first question. No problem. I think I don't have a problem with that, right? Like you said, we brought discussions about all different parts of the world. And of course, we are in Latin America. And we have a lot of issues in our region, like Cuba, Venezuela, and Chile. And I want to talk especially about Chile because it's the country that has the most economic freedom in our region, but in your index, it has the worst view about economic freedom. So tell a little bit more about what's going on.
Yeah, that was one of the more interesting observations, and the fact that it coincided with, in late 2019, the subway riots and the election that led to the constitutional referendum and so on. It actually seemed to maybe prove the point that Chile has long been admired by people like me who are just so excited to have seen the effects that came from good policy, as Chile had the best economic growth in the region. When you look at the measurements, it actually had a lower level of inequality than in many countries in the region. But but these policy changes, of course, were imposed in a liberal way by Pinochet, or they were at least descendant of that, and they were never sort of won in the hearts of the people. So it seemed that maybe all that success could be wiped away because the public appreciation for what had gone right hadn't been sort of thoroughly digested. So I think there's a great cautionary tale there that, if you remember that slide that I showed that was like, well, you need the work to create a consensus in the public mind, and that can sustain the institutions of freedom which create the growth, which would create the better outcomes for people at all levels of society. If you interrupt that chain and take out, there's an appreciation across the public, maybe nothing else works. But that said, it's been, I think, really exciting from where I sit to see a lot of really fantastic work by Chilean think tanks over the past couple of years to help explain what was at stake with the constitutional referendum and to educate people in remote parts of the country about some of the things they shouldn't take for granted and some of the problems from the proposed constitution, which did go down and it was defeated very convincingly. So I like to think that story about Chile is yet to be, there's new chapters to be written in that.
Hello.
Tem pergunta aqui. Onde?
Hello.
Olá.
Hey, my name is Mateo Giroto, and I have a doubt. So you said that to people get this economic growth and economic freedom, we need this economic mentality. But how can we get this economic mentality? Like, how can you change people's minds to know more about economic and freedom and etc.?
Yeah, well, I think that's like sort of the $1 million question, and it's the one that I spent my career in trying to figure out different strategies. At Atlas Network, what we do is, we sort of raise funds from people that want to see new efforts to tackle this question, to create a better public understanding of freedom, or to champion public policies that will lead in that direction. And there's certainly no single way. And a lot of where we think it's smart to invest are in, it really depends on the sort of the entrepreneurial mindset of the people on the ground that are going to make the change. So in some communities, it seems most important to do some sort of fundamental educational work and try to reach rising students, because it's just premature to try to work towards any particular policy reform. In other places, they will try to do sort of mass media programs, and in others, they think the conditions are right to be aiming for actual policy wins, because there's enough of an understanding, and once you see this policy in practice, maybe that's going to create more of a consensus. So I don't think there's one right way, but part of what I like about seeing more people thinking like this, it reminds me very much of the work that Deirdre McCluskey has done on economic history. She wrote a trilogy of books about a decade or so ago that sort of made the point that when people have tried to explain how human civilization went from being dirt poor to being dirt poor throughout almost all of our human history, to suddenly having this rise of living standards that started to affect people in Western Europe and the US, and now has spread more broadly. She said that it's wrong to look at it as though it's just the steam engine or these specific technological advances. She pinpointed how there was a change in rhetoric in the 17th century, where in some communities in Holland and in Britain, people started to give moral sanction to risk takers and to traders and to the people that throughout history had been sort of looked down upon because they weren't part of the existing hierarchies. They were disruptors. And so that makes a lot of sense to me, that if you want to have better institutions and policies, it really depends on the mindset. And if the mindset of the people doesn't appreciate these fundamental truths about how free societies can work, it's going to be really uphill sledding, very difficult to get good things done. I think there are questions down here in the third row.
Going back to the Chile situation, I was wondering if there is anything we can learn from them, if there is anything in Brazil we could do to get better.
Yeah, I think maybe the main the takeaway from my understanding of the situation is that a lot of the energies of the sort of free market community in Brazil, or in Chile, through the 90s and the first decade of this century and so on, was really focused on sort of the technocratic development of public policies in this very technical way, but there wasn't a whole lot of work being done around sort of the morality of free enterprise and these questions of how all of us can benefit through sort of the mutual, sort of the voluntary nature of free societies, and especially to talk about how different ethnic groups within the society can benefit from these fundamental ideas, as opposed to this narrative of us versus them, people getting rich at the expense of the poor. Those narratives, I think, are very easy to digest, and if we let them go unanswered, that they'll really take a hold of the public imagination. So when people wanted to sort of attack the institutions that made Chile so successful, I think maybe they were able to because that moral case hadn't been made very effectively.
Hello, I'm Lucas. I would like to ask about the terminology open society, because here in Brazil, it's a terminology that is used by some progressive movements that are outside Brazil. Do you believe this terminology has been captured by this progressive leftist movement? And how can we regain this term, because that's what liberty is all about?
Yeah, it's very interesting how the language plays out in different places. For me, one of the really angst-filled decisions that I made with this book was entitling it Liberalism and the Free Society. I didn't actually go for open society, maybe in part because of people's association with George Soros and differing opinions about how beneficial or evil he's been to the world. But the liberalism itself, in the United States, that's become a term that progressives have used through the years, although they've kind of forsaken it themselves. So I thought maybe it would be provocative to reclaim it, especially at a time when American, conservatives, and that used to be sort of our free market community, they've gone a little bit off the rails on some topics. So it seemed a good time to try to talk to maybe a global audience, saying, let's reclaim this word of liberalism. Whether we can reclaim open society maybe is a different question, but I think that lots of people in this community are smart to wrestle with, what's the terminology that's actually going to get people in the door. There's kind of a live conversation about whether capitalism is a term that should be fought for proudly. Ayn Rand did, the morality of capitalism, but others point out that it was Marx and his followers that coined the term, and they meant it as a derogatory term. So I don't know if we should be complicit in that. So interesting discussions, but I'm, again, not sure that there's a right answer there.
Hello. Hi, Brad. It's a pleasure to see you talking in person. And I'm Amanda. I work at Students for Liberty. And we had a very disastrous right-winged government for the last 4 years in our history. And we are clearly not evolving in that situation, because now we have one of the biggest corrupts of Brazilian history in the presidency again. And sometimes I keep asking myself, or is a liberty movement failing? So in your opinion, what can we do to fix that situation? What can we do more effectively to fix that situation in Brazilian politics?
Yeah, well, I guess maybe I'll share the advice that I give myself, because American politics has a strange similarity to Brazilian politics these days. And that's to be a little bit zen about the political ups and downs. One of the things that I've realized through the years is that the times when I've celebrated an election going right, I've sort of regretted it later because it wasn't that big a win. And the times that I've been down in the dumps because something went wrong in a political contest, usually there's an opportunity to fight for another day. And certainly there's a lot of situations we can think of where that wasn't the case, where democracy was sort of hijacked to create dictatorship, as in Venezuela. So I think that it's appropriate for everybody to be on guard about those possibilities. But I do think there's some underlying strength that you see, and even within like some of the members of the political class here that I've met in recent days. It seems like that there's some energy within Brazil that if you all keep investing in it over time, I think that the political results will be yielded. And my big hope, and this is kind of speaking as an from the U.S. first, is that some of this political polarization, where it's just so tribal, that's going to start to flame out, because it's just, you can't stay at that level of white-hot intensity for that long. So I'd like to think that if we can establish ourselves, and if there's then political leaders that will do the same, to establish themselves as sort of the adults in the room that are looking to engage with civility with people with differing opinions, but who are truly committed to principles and to seeing where the evidence lies and engineering good policy, that we can start to win over a bigger section of people that are just exhausted by the craziness of our politics in our two countries.
Thank you.
I hope that's not wishful thinking on my part. But
Well, I got another question. We are searching about the mentality of people during war. And that brings people a feeling of insecurity, and they think they should lean on the state. So how should we change the people's mind about it, how they should lean on themselves and their individualities and not the state?
Yeah, so that's very interesting, and maybe it provides me another opportunity to just emphasize for some of the people who came late that I began by talking about how the freedom movement in Ukraine, after years of kind of working together on smaller projects, has suddenly done some really exciting things in the midst of the war there. And now, as a consequence of that, we have this opportunity to shape public policy in maybe an unprecedented direction, where people would be, where the Zelensky administration is thinking about a flat tax, thinking about a deregulation regime that would make the country attractive to private industry. It would be amazing if this plays out the way that we're hoping. And I'll throw in those disclaimers again that there's lots of challenges to making it all happen. But how exciting would that be? And what a great example, because sometimes examples from particular countries can sort of change the template that others see the world through. But maybe the larger question, you're talking sort of about a psychological question that certainly is like baked into our human DNA, that when there's uncertainty, we sort of look for some sort of authority that can promise results, even if they can't deliver it. I think maybe part of our challenge as a free market community is to make people aware of all the ways that that government has let them down, how a lot of those promises have been empty. And part of the reason that I think this is a very exciting moment in history is that we all remember, right, how COVID went down and how the sort of dissenting opinions were suppressed. And now we realize that a lot of what the public health authorities said was incontrovertible science that needed to be heeded was much more complicated. And I think we should be able to make a real strong case that the top-down solutions, one-size-fits-all solutions from government shouldn't be trusted. That the real resilience that we saw during COVID came from communities troubleshooting, finding ways to keep their businesses alive, working together, that was really an effort of civil society and the private economy. And hopefully there's a lesson we can seize on.
We talked a little bit about politics, and your book, the last chapter, you talk exactly about a path forward for the freedom movement. And you give some ideas about the need for a new political alignment and some things we need to avoid. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in the last book, in the last chapter of the book, I talk a little bit about this, this lesson that I learned from a historian named Stephen Davies, who said that when you read about things in the newspapers, they always kind of treat whatever is happening as some new unprecedented change. So people talk about the rise of populism as though it's this unprecedented, unusual event. But Stephen said, no, what's happening is that every 40 or 50 years, you tend to have a change in political alignments based on changes in what people prioritize in their values. And during my lifetime, we've always had this sort of axis. If you can imagine like a 2x2 matrix where it's like, do you want more government or less government in your personal life? Do you want more government or less government in your economic life? And you could kind of locate where in the US there's like the Republican Party would be in one square, the Democrats would be in another, and us libertarians were in or a very small number in this kind of empty square. But then Stephen Davies said what's happened during our moment is that some of these contentious social divisions are receding as important matters in politics. And what has replaced it is this idea of whether you're sort of nationalist or if you consider yourself sort of cosmopolitan, that this is sort of the new tribalism that we see in our politics. And the sad and scary thing is that people who are inclined towards big government seem to be the ones that have gotten to be very good at exploiting that. So if the trajectory in front of us is that we have a choice between sort of nationalist, populist folks that believe in big government and bestowing favors on the citizenry and talking negatively about foreigners and immigrants and so on, then that seems troublesome. And if the alternative is this kind of elitist, progressive, expert class that also want to use government to pay off their favored constituencies and bestow more government benefits, that's a sort of lose-lose scenario for the freedom movement. So, but part of what I suggest is ways that we can try to upend the temptations of falling into those camps by really accentuating the inclusivity of our movement and showing that some of those divides that people believe are in our politics and that are unsolvable, that the free society agenda is welcoming to everyone, and that the opportunity that comes from a program of economic liberalism is beneficial to everyone, and that by sort of talking in more universalist terms and in getting better at some of the things we've talked about how to appeal to hearts and then minds, maybe we have a chance to change the dynamic.
We have time for one last question. So, anyone?
So, Brad, I want to change the topic a little bit. We're seeing here in Brazil, and I guess in a lot of places of the world, this woke agenda, this collectivist agenda. And I want to ask you, how do you see that in the US? Do you think that's a relevant movement there? Lots of people going woke or stuff like that? Or is like a loud minority?
Yeah, no, I think it's a loud minority that has become incredibly influential, and where I see some opportunity for people in favor of the free society is that there's been a big overreach, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity for people to call out the excesses of that movement, and here I think that you have to be very careful. It's tough to talk about this without kind of feeding into some of the tribalism that I think has been so negative for our public debate. There's ways to be inclusive and to respect the dignity of everybody without signing on to what's become a really radical social movement to kind of destroy, here thinking about the transgender community, you can respect that community without wanting to corrupt all of women's sports. And this is some of the live issues that we have, certainly in the US, that have become very divisive, but where I think that those sort of championing the woke cause have lost touch with sort of the common sense sensibilities of most Americans anyway. So I think that that's probably a politically opportune moment, as people like Governor DeSantis in Florida has proven. And it's also a really important one because some of the implications of sort of the woke agenda and how it's played out in terms of the ESG and DEI investing and sort of corporate behavior has big implications that is really troublesome for those of us who favor free markets that aren't corrupted by political preferences. So I think it's an important one, but because it's sort of driven mostly by a loud minority, I think it's one that really spells a great area of opportunity for people defending the free society to find a lot of allies who just look at this in a common sense way and don't want the politicization of their investments, of their schools, and so on.
Well, we just have more time for more questions. So anyone?
I can hear you. Yeah. There you go.
Thank you for being here. So my question is, in the book Why Nations Fails from James Robson, it explains that inclusive institutions provide free economy in general. So in Brazil, we don't have an inclusive constitution. In our opinion, what is our alternative? Should we fight for a new constitution here, or what is another thing that we can do to have a better moment for the liberal ideas in our country?
Yeah, so that's the kind of question that I like to fall back on we defer to people who know the local situation better than I before we give advice. I do think that we should be very wary about sort of big changes from the top down, that they're constitutional reforms, and in my experience of watching things almost never wind up where you expect them to. So I'm sort of a fan of looking at incremental change and where you can make a difference sort of within the existing rules. But again, I'm no expert on the Brazilian Constitution, so I'd want to defer on that one. But an interesting question I'll be interested to talk to you further about to learn more.
Another one? So I can make another question, because I read your whole book. So you said in your book, you talk a little bit about some examples. You brought some examples here around the world. But I want to talk a little bit more about the examples in the book and the importance of freedom to work, which is our project here. And so tell us a little bit more about the importance of freedom to work and how it can help, especially poor people, get more money and get a better life.
Yeah, and I think that this is also one of those stories that's kind of attractive for telling a broader audience about what we stand for, and for dispelling these widely held incorrect views that those who favor free enterprise are always looking out for the rich, and we kind of look like the monopoly man and all of that. Some of the stories that I really enjoy in recent years have to do with the street vendors of India and the amazing work that our partners in New Delhi did in saying, you know, for too long, these people who hustle for their livelihoods, they've had a saying that said that they can only grow your business the length of your arms, because since you didn't have a legal right to be selling your goods, you needed to be aware that the police could crack down at any time and do a sweep of the neighborhood, and you need to be able to grab the edges of your blanket and, you know, get the heck out of there. And that's a terrible way to live. And our partners in New Delhi said, you know, these people are entrepreneurial, you know, that they're adding value, that, you know, their customers visit them every day, they should have legal standing. And that type of work, I think, is really heroic in making it easier for the vast majority of people who are just working to provide a better life for their families, to give them the dignity and the security that they can use their talents in freedom. And that's just, I think, a wonderful narrative. And we're seeing in other parts of the world, including in the US, and certainly including in Brazil, how important it is to realize that government often has created these obstacles that don't serve the public interest, that make it difficult to work in the legal economy, to be permitted to be employed in a particular profession. And those rules, I think, are just really detrimental to the health of the economy and to the fundamental dignity of people. So I love that our partners have made a difference on those topics, and I think it's a great one for us to talk about when we are talking to people who have suspicions about the free market, who believe that socialism is necessary to help people improve their lot. We can show that, no, if you really believe in the dignity and the potential of people, you should be looking at other ways to help them have the freedom and the opportunity to use their own talents and to have the confidence that freedom provides that.
Great. Thank you, Brad, for your knowledge and for your ideas. Thank you all. And get your free copy of the book at 8 o'clock. Brad will be there to sign your book for you, so you can get more ideas and more insights. We are just, I think, just nearby the downstairs, right? So thank you very much, and see you around.
Obrigada também ao Marcelo Faria pela mediação deste penúltimo painel. Gente, estou convidando a todos para permanecerem aqui no nosso teatro, porque em 30 segundos a gente vai começar o último bloco da nossa Arena da Liberdade 2023. 30 segundos mesmo.